Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest episode of Peace Solve for X Solutions that Spark Change. My guest today is Mira Lane. She is the Partner Director of Ethics and Society within Cloud and AI at Microsoft. Mira runs a multidisciplinary team within an engineering context that is responsible for guiding technical and experience innovation towards ethical, responsible, and sustainable outcomes. So how awesome is that? Mira, welcome.
Thank you.
It was so great to be introduced to you through Kate O'Sullivan at Microsoft. And I'm just sort of did this immediate deep dive. I read your Medium article. I looked at the responsible innovation website, Microsoft, looked at your harms modeling, which I absolutely fell in love with. The whole harms modeling taxonomy is like, yes, right on. It is like, make it like, spell it out for, idiot product developers. It's like, are you causing psychological harm? Here's an example. And you're like, oh, maybe I am.
Exactly.
How did you get into this line of work? And, especially for Microsoft, because I'm old enough to remember when Microsoft was like, the bad guy, quote unquote, back in the 90s and so on. They were the tech behemoth. And now Microsoft is like, wait, what? You're responsible innovation, responsible engineering, and you guys are really leading the charge on this. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I think we've grown up a lot since then. But so first, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm a big fan of your work, and I love that we are talking about responsible AI and ethics at an industry level. I think that's just a difference in how we've thought about technology from even a few years ago. So this is just a moment that I think is very unique in our industry, and it's, I think, almost a maturing of the industry also. So you're referring to Microsoft being the bad guys many years ago, and I look at the company that we're in right now, and it's matured in so many ways. It's matured culturally. We have a CEO that's talking about growth mindset and having hard conversations and creating this space to be able to do that. And so as we think about all the work that we're doing on responsible AI, if we don't have that type of top level support, it doesn't create the right conditions in the organization to even start a group like mine, to even start that conversation and have it be successful. So I think that that's just a really interesting part of Microsoft right now, where it has matured into that role, where we've had those hard moments with antitrust, and we've kind of learned a lot from that, and so we're kind of growing into our own, so to speak. And so what I've done with my team, I started it a few years ago. I started it in 2017, and I was, looking around at my next role, and I was kind of eyeing what was happening in Microsoft research and the AI space, and I thought, oh, I want to get into that part of the world. I want to do a little bit more there. And there was an opportunity to run a design team in this new incubation group that was just starting out. And what we had realized at the time was the technology coming out of Microsoft research was at a place where you could productize it very quickly. And traditionally what we see in Microsoft research is there's a long lead time. It's 10 years, 15 years before something in research can mature into becoming product. But with AI, we were seeing this quick turnaround where new advances we were able to productize it so quickly. And so I decided to run that design team for this incubation group, but contingent on me accepting that role was me running an ethics effort also. And I thought, this is a moment where we can really have this dialogue.
So what motivated you to run an ethics effort? And what gave you the courage to say, hey, let's think about ethics? And did they give you the stink eye?
People were surprised at the beginning because they were like, oh, we weren't expecting that as your response. And I think maybe this is just me being a mom, maybe to put it in that perspective, but I feel a deep sense of responsibility. And you and I've talked about this too, like, what is our role in the work we're doing and what do we represent? And I have 2 kids, and I look at the world that we're creating for them, and I realize that I have a hand in creating that world. And so what I wanted to do was play a more active role in shaping it. And And so I had this just deep sense of responsibility. And I was like, I wanted the work to be deeply meaningful as well.
Yeah.
And it felt like it was a dialogue that was missing also.
Yeah, I certainly find that for women and communities of color when they get into tech, or that what repels them from tech is that they can't find the meaning and purpose that they're looking for, right? To code just for the sake of coding is just
Right.
not compelling enough. It's like,
Right.
who cares? And there's I remember like when my son was born, there's something about having a child that really can radicalize you in some ways, in like very deep, quiet ways, where you realize you actually have a stake in the future,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because you're looking at this beautiful child and you're going like, oh my God, now I'm a steward. What kind of world is that child going to live in when they're my age? And I'm
Yep.
constantly doing that calculus in my head of like, okay, what's the world going to look like when Ben is my age?
Yep.
When
Yep.
he's, whether it's 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever. And I'm going like, okay, so I'm in my mind, I'm constantly playing this long game of what is it that I can do. And so that way I can tell him when I die, I did everything I could. I left everything on the field. I did
Yes.
absolutely everything I could to shape the future in a way that he could be happy and thrive to whatever
Yep.
extent that is. Whether it's say like, okay, no college debt, okay, really like that, there's just like a billion big and little things, but it's always in the back of my mind as a subroutine of running like, okay, what am I doing and how is this going to shape the world that he's going to walk into for it's a gift to his future self.
It
And I'm
really is.
constantly thinking about that. I don't know
Yep.
how old your kids are, but mine is he's 20 now. So
Oh yeah, mine are like, I'm 10 and 11, but I have a very similar mindset. It's that subroutine that's always in the background and looking at the decisions you're making and saying, is this the best thing you could be doing right now? And then I think I also have children um, who would look back at me and say, hey, did you try your hardest? What did you do?
right.
You knew that
Yeah.
technology was affecting us in this way. What did you do about that?
Right.
What role did you play? And I know they would interrogate me in 10 years, in 15 years. And I want to be really thoughtful about my presence and my energy and where it gets placed, especially at a large company like Microsoft. When you look at the footprint of our corporation, and there's so many different ways that we touch people's lives, I thought even if I can meaningfully move that in 1 degree, that is a profound impact on the industry. And so
Especially
it just
over
felt like
time.
you got to do it. You
Yeah.
have to do it. Yep. Over
Yeah.
time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in terms of the arc of my career, certainly the last 10 years working around peace innovation, and then in the last 3 or 4 years around peace engineering and engaging with these engineering schools and saying like, how do we reimagine engineering so they're trained in ethics, and
Yeah.
how do we put ethics in all the courses so it's not an elective that people say, oh, that's a fuzzy course, I'm not going to take it.
Yeah. It's not
But
optional.
it's not optional. It's like we want you to think with every project that you do, how do you do it ethically? What are the ethical ramifications? What are the harms?
Mhm.
Um, because certainly as technologists, certainly in Silicon Valley, it's been like, okay, let's move quick and break things. And you go like, but the things that you break are really important. I mean, it's
Right.
almost like we didn't know how to assess risk in Silicon Valley. We just saw the upside, but we say like, yeah, there might be this upside, but when it goes wrong,
Mhm.
is that cost? Can you recover from that cost? Can you recover from that harm? Um,
And
and
who's
having those hard
responsible?
conversations.
Yeah, and who's
Yeah.
responsible for recovering from that? Because traditionally we've said, "Oh, government, you're responsible for helping us in society." If we have a net supposedly that catches people when they hit bottom, and so there's been this traditional, well, that's not our problem to go and put those safety nets in. We'll go innovate, and then someone else will go and solve the ramifications of that. And
Right.
so you see that in healthcare, and you see that in the way that we do taxes and schooling and all of that. There's disruption happening here, but without the responsibility and the accountability to handle what happens when you do disrupt in a negative way.
Right. On the other hand, other sectors do have safety.
Yes.
You know, there are seatbelts in cars. I mean, there is a highway transportation agency that looks at, you know, safety and mobility. There are, you know, I'm sure that the toaster that I have is engineered for safety, and they've, you know, really thought about it, because you know, don't want the toaster in there and then have the burn down the kitchen, right? But it's only in software we go like, harm. It's kind of crazy.
It is
And is
crazy.
Yeah, and maybe it's because there's this kind of disconnect because it's not physical. It's like it's just sort of this ones and zeros. So how much harm can it actually create versus, you know, um, a power saw that could cut your finger off, right? It's like, okay, you know, it's
Yeah.
very cause and effect. You can, it's the line is very sharp, right?
You know, on that,
But
I think our language is poorly suited for the cause and effects of technology, because your toaster, if that catches fire, you see that immediate response.
Mhm.
With technology, because it is diffuse sometimes, because it connects to so many different things, that cause and effect isn't always as clear. And so it changes many hands sometimes, or it goes over an arc of time. And I think that our vocabulary is, it needs to get advanced so that we can have that conversation.
yeah. So when you came in and you said, okay, but I want to do this, but with ethics, how did you proceed? How did you start the conversation? What was already in place that you could work with, or who did you seek out to give you guidance in terms of, um, you know, having an ethical roadmap?
Oh, I mean, so there was not a lot in place to snap into. It was brand new, start from scratch. Like, it was really starting from whole cloth and shaping something. We at Microsoft, we had our Ether committee that had just started up at the same time as well. And so we were all kind of navigating it together. But our Ether committee was operating at more of a corporate global level and looking at
Mhm.
global level topics. And so the thing that I ended up doing is, because I have such a strong background in product development and design and, you know, develop engineering, um, I started to take the approach of ethics through innovation and ethics through building better product, and
Mhm.
speaking out about it at the engineering level, and saying, okay, for the most part, the things you're doing, um, you're not doing anything that's truly awful. What you're doing are, you don't quite understand the consequences of what's being built. And so could we design it in such a way where we understand those consequences and then put those safeguards into place in the product? And so my lens throughout all of this has been through product innovation. That's why I sit in my organization sits deep in the engineering stack. We try to embed as deeply as we can in code and with our engineers, so that we get to like the problem. We get so proximate to the problem that we can live it and understand it, so that we're not kind of an outside team. And so that was the approach. It was just, let's go about it through innovation. And because one of the things we found was that as soon as you start critiquing from the outside, people shut you out. They don't
Yeah.
want you in the room, they don't want you in the conversation. And then they'll pull you in at the end to say, hey, give us your stamp. But they won't bring you in at the beginning when that's like the crucial time to do it, right?
Right. You can't help shape it. And
Exactly.
so what's been interesting to me is, as we've been talking to people around tech ethics, is, you know, the importance of ethics and safety and security at the point of design, at the point of innovation, right? And not as an afterthought, because it's perceived as a cost or as a blocker. It's like, oh, you're
Right,
trying to slow us down, right?
right.
Oh, you're just, you know, you're a you're a hassle, you're a cost. You're slowing us down from shipping, and so we're going to ignore you, right? As
Yeah.
opposed to saying, well, how do you use ethics as a variable, as a design variable? And, you know, if you do design thinking, we go, you got to start with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you add an ethics layer to design thinking? So like, as you're, you know, doing the need finding, you're doing all this stuff, and you're doing your rapid prototyping and testing and feedback loop and everything, how do you integrate those ethics questions as both design opportunities and design constraints?
And you
Right?
know, I think constraints are really powerful in design. In some ways, sometimes more than opportunities, because they activate a different part of the problem solving framework in your mind, and they are real sources of innovation. One of the things that I think we started doing really early on, I was talking to you about this before as well, our harms modeling work really took from this idea of security threat modeling, because when you're designing a new system, right at the beginning, this is a common practice in engineering, you look at your threat surface area and you look at different ways that your service or product can get compromised, different thresholds in terms of security, and you start to create kind of a network of view of your system. And so we looked at that and said, hey, you know, we have really poor vocabulary around harm and impact. And we've got this pattern already around security threat modeling. What's the ethics equivalent of that? And that's where our harms modeling work really came into play, because one thing it helped us do was normalize on a taxonomy and say, hey, what are you talking about when you say don't do any harm? What am I talking about? Do we agree that those things are important? Do we agree that those are a reality? And so one of the most important things when you're doing something quite new at the beginning is doing that alignment around language, taxonomy, so that you could have a shared understanding. And so that harms modeling exercise is really tailored around that shared understanding and creating a framework for common vocabulary, putting things down in a way that people understand, and then being able to use it. Not just saying, okay, here's the words and here's the framework, but then how do you use it? For the exercises you go through to start to exercise that moral imagination. What could happen? What might happen? What's likely to happen? What kinds of things did you design around that would cause, challenges in your system? What kinds of things would you need to like work through? And so all of that, that's a whole framework around modeling through harm. And I'll say that that's been a real eye-opener for everyone, because now we've created the space to even have the conversation. Because if you don't even write the words down or exercise that muscle, you haven't given people the permission to even talk about what could go wrong, which is always hard to do.
Oh yeah. And also there's like what could go wrong, and if it's not part of your lived experience, right? If you're super young, I can say this because I've had many rounds around the sun. It's like what I thought I knew when I was 20 or 22, I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about the human condition. I mean, I kind of knew, but I did, right? And then when you have a kid, you go like, I can tell you the 99 ways that this can go wrong right now, just with that little ball, just like you, all of a sudden your imagination, I think as a parent, and certainly as a parent of a small child, your harms modeling imagination just expands, because you go like, did you like, okay, yeah, like your mind can really go there in a way that you can't when you're 22 and you're single, right?
Yeah. I think you're completely right on that your lived experience really shields you from being able to think through some of those harms. And in terms of age, and also just, some of us don't interact with technologies in a way that are deeply harmful. Like when you're building technology, you're often in a very privileged position. And so you are not you're not on the receiving end of some of the more challenging aspects of technology. And this is where I think not just trying to pretend you're a different individual, but really bringing in people who have that lived experience and starting to build out that muscle of empathy as well, and making sure that that voice has a way to get into product as well. So, we ended up doing this other piece of work that we call community jury, which is really bringing in people that are affected by a piece of technology and connecting them with the experts who are building it, so that there's a dialogue that's happening between them. They can then say, here's my concerns, here's where I am worried about technology. And we recruit along this lots of different spectrums. But one that we did recently was we recruited along the privacy spectrum, people that really care deeply about their privacy. And some people are like, everything I do is kind of public anyway, I don't care as much. So that you can facilitate that type of conversation. And you can't do that when you're in your own bubble. And we are in a tech bubble, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I grew up in Southern California, Hispanic, loud, noisy, Mexican American family, and we had family that was on the other side of the border in Tijuana, and then family in San Diego, family that lived in the hood, that lived in the barrio, that lived in I mean, it was just like, it was a mezcla of everything. People who, I had cousins who didn't speak very good English with a Spanish accent, and then I didn't speak very good Spanish with an English accent. I mean, it was, as I say, the whole catastrophe. And varying levels of education and income and everything else. And then I come to Silicon Valley, it's like very,
Yes. Yes.
everyone is very striving, ambitious. They were the class valedictorian, every single one of them. I don't, it's amazing how zip code can support so many,
So
class
many
valedictorians.
valedictorians in one place.
So many 4.0s. And then you go like, but you got to talk to like the regular people, the person who got, got a certificate at the community college so they could be a nurse's aide. And basically what they do is they work in the nursing home and they help people get dressed and change sheets and all that. And because that's one of your cousins, right?
Yep.
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's just like the lived experience becomes more and more important than the engineering skills. Because in some ways, I know this sounds like heresy, but you can teach anyone technical skills, but you can't necessarily teach
Yeah.
them empathy.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think
Right?
that there's an element of respect here also, right? If we are building technology and we're not having that conversation, that to me is a really disrespectful way of building technology, where we haven't created the time or space for us to even understand how someone might use it or be impacted by it. And so I think that there's this shift towards like, what does respectful design look like?
Yeah.
And then how do you have that engagement and really then have that deeply influence what you build, not just say, okay, I checked the box, we had the conversation, great, I feel good about us, but we didn't really
Right.
meaningfully change anything.
So how do you change like the power dynamic in design thinking? Because it can be very much, I, superior designer, have come to study you, person in the indigenous group of whatever, and I'm going to do my field guide and take photos of you and take videos of you and interview you, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to make this a magical, amazing thing for you, right? So there's
Yeah.
there's still an objectification of the community.
Yeah.
How do you get around that? I mean, it's a really wickedly hard problem because there's sort of like, especially this year in terms of when we were talking about the legacy of slavery and colonialism and so on in our culture, in Western culture. And as I started looking at it, it's one of those, now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it sort of things. The intersectionality of that with everything. And you go like, even as a woman of color, I'm going like, okay, I'm being mestiza, I'm half Native American, half the other bit. And so I have the colonizer and the colonized inside me.
Yes. Yes.
The thing like your DNA kind of going like,
Yeah.
both experiences are part of my heritage. So how do you reconcile that? And how do you rewrite that social contract going forward so that you can do respectful design, you can have this appreciation of different voices, different talents, and still get stuff done, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
there's the practical urgencies of a business and getting things out.
Yeah.
How do you manage that tension?
That's such a hard question because I don't know if there's like a, do X, Y, and Z, and then suddenly you found the formula to do it. I think that there is, you like to ask these hard questions. I love that about the way you think. There's also this dynamic where design is so far removed sometimes from even the product work because design takes time and our engineers are running quickly and trying to get something out the door. And so even from that standpoint, even before we start saying, hey, let's bring in those affected by technology, design needs to have a seat at the table too, because oftentimes they actually don't. They are chasing after the engineers who've already built something because they want to get a quick prototype up and running. And before you know it, that prototype became the thing that got shipped, and you didn't get to do all the deep research that you needed to do to shape that thing in the right place. And so I think that there's a big question about like, how do you have design at the table also? And then when you have design at the table, how does design not just represent end users, but bring the end users to the table also. So I think that
Right.
there's
So they're
kind of
part
like
of
this
they're
chain
part of the
of,
team as well, right?
yes,
It's sort of like
right,
reimagining what a design team looks like, what a product development team looks like,
right, right.
right? So
And
it's more kind of
giving them the
stakeholder
vocabulary.
oriented. Hmm. Yeah.
Well,
And
and giving them the vocabulary as well. I mean, one of the things we found with AI is that this transformation happened so quickly that it left a lot of disciplines behind. And so
mhm.
people, and nobody wants to ask those dumb questions like, I don't really understand AI. What does that mean? But I'm the one designing it. So, what, you know, having some intentional work and training that comes to, you know, help these disciplines understand this is the technology. Here's what's actually happening under the hood. Here's the limitations of it. Now you can go and design it knowing how this technology actually works. That's a big part of that kind of transformation also.
Yeah. There's this tendency towards solutionism in engineering, in this mindset, like, oh, well, it's like the hint of a problem. Okay, got it. And you're going like, and so it's like it's a rush to solution
Yep.
rather than sitting with the problem. And especially as technology, um, I talk about how technology, back when I started, previous century, when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, and I was making, I was putting together PCs and putting the chips in, by hand, way back then. The technology innovation was one, like you had like a personal computer, and what did you do? You had a spreadsheet, because the technology innovation was we needed better ways to count things. Right? And then we wanted to replace typewriter. So it was like, okay, so we're going to do this word processing. Woohoo, that was the 80s. Now it's technology affecting how people live and how people interact, right? So it's not about manufacturing and keeping track of bills and materials and how many screws you need in this assembly, right? Which is how I spent my career in the 80s. It's really about this persuasive technology, this mediating technology that is sort of like the man in the middle between two people interacting with each other. And so
Yeah.
all of a sudden, the psychology of all this gets super, super complicated, right? And of course, we've seen it weaponized in terms of misinformation and deep fakes and all this other stuff. So that gets really, really treacherous when we start playing with or manipulating the human mind, right? In our behavior and all of that.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing to something that I have a bit of a pet peeve on too, and where we use our metrics around consumption. We use our metrics around like time spent to drive product, where we say, hey, that's actually high quality engagement. And what that inadvertently does is it incentivizes the whole system to optimize around hijacking attention, to hijacking a big chunk of your life. And I think there's something deeply broken about the way that we internally track our metrics around like what does good engagement look like. And we have, again, like really poor proxies for engagement. Time spent in a certain service, that's what we spend, and then we say, oh, the more time the better. And then we're like, okay, well, let's optimize that. And that's what leads to a lot of these filter bubbles, people getting sucked into these online video, services, things like that. It just, those are internal metrics that are driving the external engagement with the product.
Yeah. And, back in the day, when I worked with my interns, my co-ops, I go, look, once upon a time, I was a remote control for my dad. He would say, Miha, go change the channel. I'd get up and I'd go change the channel for him. And you got what you got in terms of content, and you couldn't binge watch. I mean, if you wanted to see Love Boat, you had to wait for the next Saturday night for it to come up. It's like, gotta wait. And so there were natural points of friction. So we didn't get into these addictive sort of loops when the technology just wasn't possible. We just didn't have that ability. And of course, we didn't have any measurement either. When you think about the mid 2000s and how certainly for Microsoft in the 1990s, you all didn't have any analytics about, user behavior with Microsoft Office. You had no idea how many minutes or hours someone spent in a Microsoft doc, because it came, in this huge box with 10 CD-ROMs. You sold it, you were done, you go, yay, I made my sale, my per seat sale, we won, hey.
Yep.
And you know, whether they used it once or 1,000 times, you didn't care because you made your money. And now with these subscription models and these, you know, SaaS kind of models, it, you know, you want people to constantly be using it. And I'm going like, well, I mean, if toast was sold as a service, my God, you know, can you imagine they'd be going like, sell her more bread. She's not making enough of toast today. More toast.
Optimize the
I
amount
mean,
of toast you're
it would
having.
be absurd in any other part of your life, right? You know, if shampoo as a service is like, you haven't washed your hair enough today.
Yeah.
Go
But you
wash
know,
your hair again.
you're pointing to this really important observation that there are natural barriers that were in place that were, and that's why that we didn't actually have certain laws in place also, because there were just these natural barriers. And we're seeing those start to get eroded. There are natural barriers around surveillance, right? You can walk around with a video camera and videotape everyone in an area, and that natural barrier prevented it from happening. It also prevented any real regulation from being formed because it wasn't really an issue at the time. And now, as you walk around, I remember I was driving through downtown Bellevue, and I was looking around and I was like at an intersection, how many cameras are at this intersection right now? What are all those cameras doing? What are they used for? And you start to look at the infrastructure around you and what's getting put into place. And then you start playing through this, you know, this game of like, well, now that you have this infrastructure in place, you're going to be incentivized to use it and make some ROI on the infrastructure you put in place. And so, like, what does that lead to? And there's kind of this like, you just start going down this rabbit hole and you start pulling that thread, and you're like, oh my goodness, we're removing a lot of these natural barriers that you're talking about.
Yeah, I was talking to the city manager for the city of Wellington in New Zealand a couple of years ago at a conference at Stanford. And it was like smart cities, and we're going to have digital this and Internet of Things, and it was going to be great, right? And I was one of the few women in at the conference. I don't know about you, but I have this habit of counting noses and going like, how many women are here, right? It's like, you know, tables of 10. It's like, okay, no, no, no. I just do that. It's, speaking of all the funky subroutines, and then I go like, are there any like tan people there, right? Nope, nope, nope. Like I'm usually like the only Hispanic Latina thing ever. Like there aren't any others except me. I am the token one to represent in a crowd of 300, right? African Americans, maybe one or two, not really. So anyway, so I'm talking to this guy, and everyone's like, rah, rah, IoT, it's going to be great, this and that. And he comes up and he says, we actually surveyed our citizens to ask them what they wanted. And he said, not a single one of them said they wanted a solar powered street. What they said is, we want parks, we want trees, we want, you know, wide sidewalks because mothers and strollers and bicycles and the whole thing. And he goes, so we, instead of Wellington being a place where people worked and left, they said they turned it into a community where people stayed and played.
Wow.
Right. And he stayed, and so he was there, and everyone's going like, yeah, I'm going to sell you this IoT thing for your smart city. And he's going like, you know what? To be perfectly honest, that's not what my citizens want.
Yeah.
And when I've done executive ed at Stanford, I'll talk to these CEOs and I go, okay, so here's the vision of the future. The AI robots are going to take over, and we're all going to be unemployed, and they're going to take over and everything else, and that's the future. How many of you are saying a hell yes to that future? And everyone's sitting there going like, and I go, so if it's not a hell yes, why are you all making plans for that? And so like, you know, is this actually the outcome that you want? Like, let's lead from the future. It's 5 years from now. It's 10 years from now. It's a magic wand. You can imagine anything you want. Do you want to be unemployed and have been disintermediated by a technology that does everything, and you go, I have no meaning and purpose. Why am I even alive?
Yeah.
Because let me tell you, there are a lot of white men in the US Midwest who are dying of deaths of despair because of that. And you're going like, and so what we want is more of that. I mean, I'm interested, I'm curious about, and I love technology, but I'm going like, I actually want technology that serves me, that actually makes my life more meaningful, more
Yeah.
impactful
Yep.
in the things that I want to do as a human being. But dystopian cybernetic futures, at least for me, just hold no appeal. It's
Yeah, I
like,
don't know if people are intentionally going and saying, let's go build this dystopian future. I think what's happening is that there's a tendency to look at everything through rose-colored glasses and to say, oh, we want to go help and save, we want to go find lost children. We want to go be able to like make it faster for you to go through a grocery store so that you don't have to pull out your card so you can use your face to pay for it. And so there are technologists who have this utopian view. And because if you were to ask them, they would say, no, I don't have a dystopian view. I have this utopian view of technology making life easier for you. And the challenge is that that same utopian view, you just do a slight shift in the way you look at it, it becomes dystopian so easily. And
right.
and it's hard for people to look at it because it means that the work that they're doing can have that dystopian impact. And that's
Yeah.
deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Um, yeah. I I certainly remember the conversations in the Valley in the 90s, in the early days of the internet. It's like, oh, it's going to be great.
Yep.
It's going to be great. And so it's almost like Google's, don't be evil, right?
Yeah.
And you go, that's not exactly an ethical framework. I mean, because you're putting it on the shoulders of individuals to figure out what not being evil is,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to say your harms taxonomy. We were talking about digital dignity, and I love that phrase. I'm going like, digital dignity. Oh my God, what do you mean? And you're saying like, well, privacy loss. So,
Mhm.
okay, what do we mean by privacy loss? Interference with your private life. And I'm going like, yeah, I mean, if we wanted to pick our nose at the intersection, we couldn't because there are 10 cameras on us. And, not to speak of people's, phones and et cetera, et cetera. It's sort of like if you just want to have a place where you can feel like you have some privacy outdoors, out in a common space, you
Yep.
really don't have it. So what is your right to a private life? And if you had asked, our grandparents or our great grandparents 100 years ago, they'd be going like, what? You mean I can't just go for a walk somewhere in the woods or out in nature and I have to be surveilled all the time just in case something bad happens? And
Hmm.
honestly, how often does something bad happen?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. You're absolutely
So
right.
we've kind of exaggerated um, crime and physical harm in many ways
Hmm. And use
because
technology as a solution for this manufactured fear, right?
right, because when you look at the statistics, the data on crime, it's been falling for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but something bad might happen. So I need to have this thing for security. And I'm going like, I know it could happen, but the probability actually is pretty darn low.
Yeah.
So if I step back and I look at all the money that we've spent on all this technology for a harm that doesn't actually exist versus the lack of spending on harms that really do exist,
Hmm. Hmm.
it's just heartbreaking because you're looking, we haven't really done anything for mental health, mental illness. We haven't really addressed the issues of people who are homeless or displaced. We haven't really addressed the issues of, um, you know, um, lack of equitable education, on and on. It's just like those are real harms.
Yes. Yep. Those are the
Some
real harms.
boogeyman who's going to jump out of a bush while I'm
Yeah.
running is not a real harm.
Yes. This is where,
Because let
I
me tell you,
mean,
when I'm running, I'm always scanning for the guy in the bush, and I have yet to find a guy in a bush.
I've never seen a guy in a bush either. I mean, I think this, and we can go down this kind of like, here's all the reasons why this is broken, but uh, the mental health and the relationship with technology, or the these issues around education and access, the cynic side of me worries that these issues, the way that they're perceived is that people don't feel like there's enough money in there. And so they don't pursue solving those spaces or pursue that with the same tenacity that they would some of the other issues that are being solved right now. And so I think that there's a need to bring that into more of a forefront, into a larger dialogue. So it becomes something that we all say, yes, we need to solve this. Anyone who has kids, I was looking at I was going through my Facebook feed the other day, and I try not to go into social media too often, but every once in a while I'll go in, and someone had posted this thing to a parent's alias that said, does this happen to anyone where after about 30 minutes of using X technology, your child turns into a monster and it becomes incredibly hard to manage your child? And they started going on and just listing out all of the symptoms and what happens to their child. There were 500 responses to that post within the first 2 hours, and every single one of them said, yes, me too, this happens to me, and here's an example. And I saved that because I was like, this is the problem we're facing right now. Well, where are we solving this? Where are we having this dialogue? And I think that needs to be continually brought to the forefront, because it's not getting enough attention, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to, it's sort of like there's a connection between ethics and business models.
Yes.
Because you might, because business models can push people to do things that have unethical outcomes, even though they're not really, again, we're good people, we're nice people, we're educated people, we want to do the right thing. And then next thing you know, like you've drifted into this lane that you had no intention of drifting into, right? Because it's actually, the problem in some ways is so compartmentalized. It's above your pay grade. It's like, oh, that actually isn't your, once you've handed that off, it's someone else's issue, and then they do whatever they do with it, and you have no say in the matter as it moves downstream, right? And one of the I think interesting fallacies in the Valley was this notion that cost and time were bugs, right? And so like what our goal is to make everything free. Like, oh, if it costs something, that's bad. We need to make it free. If it takes time, that's bad. We need to reduce the friction. And actually, cost is a very useful feature because it regulates people's behavior. It's a friction point, right? And you're going like, well, like when they had the New Zealand shooter, and he was doing it on Facebook Live, and part of the motivation was because he could do it on Facebook Live. And I'm going like, Facebook could have shut that down within 24 hours and saying, we're going to do a 5-minute delay, or we're going to do a 1-hour delay, or we're going to do a 24-hour delay. Or like, if you want to do it live, you got to pay for the service, and it's going to cost you, some professional fee, because certainly people who are professionals, but some random guy who just wants to shoot people, it's like, okay, how badly do you want to do it? And if so, it's going to cost you $10,000. And you probably go like, well, maybe not, but we can play with those friction points in terms of pricing, in terms of time, and say like, okay, so you're an influencer and like, you can't do it live. There's a delay. You go like, okay, well, that's just the way it is, right? But as my police officer friend used to refer to them, but for the knuckleheads, you could just sort of like filter a lot of that bad behavior out just like that, right? Because they don't get the instant gratification, and it's going to cost them something. There is a reason, like back in the 90s.
This is a hard one though, Margarita, because that may solve one problem, but then you've created a barrier to entry at the same time as well.
Right.
And so you're pointing to the complexity of some of these problems, and access, and having the ability to not be a professional but then still be able to run a business as and so maybe that so how do you work through those tensions? And I think that's where these types of exercises, these types of activities within the development of product context helps you really get at like, what are we trying to activate here? What are the goals? And if we make this decision, what gets shut out? And in some cases, there may be some harms that are shut out, but then what other good things were shut down as a result as well? And then be able to look at those and say, okay, well, are we making the right decision? I think what's happening as well right now is these decisions are not as easy as they were before. I think when technology was a little bit more in its, I don't want to say infancy, but it 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, when the iPhone first came out, we were in a different era, and we didn't have such complex decision making at play, right? And so you have to
We
start
didn't have the
thinking through that.
ability.
Right, we didn't have the
We did.
ability, exactly.
We didn't have the ability. We didn't have the analytics. We didn't have the
Right.
tracking. We didn't have the sensors in the environment or on our phone to collect all this data in a passive way.
Yeah,
So again, sort of like, what data can I collect from someone using a CD-ROM in their computer? Nothing,
yep,
right?
yep.
So, but it's not clear to me that all the petabytes of data that are being collected are necessary, because you talk to
Yeah.
corporations that have big data, and certainly when I was interacting with Deloitte like 5, 6, 7 years ago, and the conversation was about big data and with these Fortune 500 companies, and they had all this data, but they didn't. It's sort of like having, it's sort of like that scene at Raiders of the Lost Ark at the end where you have like boxes and boxes in this warehouse, and they got the data, but
We're hoarders right now. Yeah.
nobody knows what's in there, and nobody knows how to get it out. It's sort of like, okay, it's just in there with all the other boxes. So there's this like the hoarding behavior around the
Yeah.
data.
Yeah.
But there's not enough talent. I mean, there aren't enough data scientists to hire. And then how do you interpret the data is the other
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
So can you identify when there's holes in the data, like who's missing, which we
And who
saw
needs
like with
to,
the,
exactly.
right? So like if we go, does anyone ever notice that women aren't out and about, and like, wait a minute, there's this negative space where women should be in the economy,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
We
Things
do a
like
lot of
that.
this as well. I mean, we look at, there's been, we spend a lot of time on our cognitive services looking at, face recognition, speech recognition, and looking at, well, who's missing out of this? And, oh, does this work for everyone in various accents? And does it work for women as well as men and children as well? And so I think there's a lot of intentionality being put behind this now, and there's a lot of new tools that are coming out also that help people start to go and interpret and analyze their data, and even around not just their data, but where errors in your models occur too. What we found is there's clustering of errors, and so you may have I don't know if I told you about this before, but you may have the hypothesis that your model is racist, that is biased against a certain group of individuals. And then you kind of go down and look at all those clusters of errors. We've built some tooling around this, and we realized actually it wasn't skin color that was causing the problem. It was the fact that in this data set, we had women with short hair who weren't wearing eye makeup, and they were being mistaken for men. And so as a result, it looked like from the outset we had a skin color issue because it was along a certain, it happened to cut along a race and a skin tone, but in reality, it was that our data set was a little bit skewed over here, and it caused this large set of errors over here on this subpopulation. And so we start to need these more robust tools in how we think about data. And one of the things that we've been talking about is how do you treat your data like you do code? Because what you've traditionally done is dump data into like, okay, we've got this, like, it's just a blob, but you need to start treating it with the level of versioning and management that you do with code, like a level of robustness that you have with code, so that you can then go back and interrogate what you used as the ingredients for your models, and a level of hygiene around that as well. And so I think that there's, again, another maturing that needs to happen around all the tooling as well, around introspecting your data and your models.
It's almost like looking at the site, like when you buy food and you have the nutrition label, and they tell you, okay, it's got this many grams of protein and this many carbs, and oh my God, that much sugar. It's like we want to know, and you go like, I need to have a gluten-free diet, and say like you're constantly looking at the boxes and the cans and everything. You're like, oh, dang it, potato starch, can't have potato starch. Why is it everywhere? So how would we do that, like with data sets, where you could say, look, it's got 3% this bias and 2% that bias and 20% of this goodness and way too much sugar, so that way you could at least be informed of it, and people would say like, yeah, we're getting this, and it skews this way.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, there's a whole initiative in the industry right now around data sheets, and it literally is that ingredient, the label that you were talking about, that helps you understand what went into this data set, and what does the composition of it look like. I think that's a piece of it, and I think then the other piece is then being able to go and have a set of tools that help you do a lot of what if analysis, be able to kind of go and explore and introspect that data even more. It feels like there's that data sheet is the beginnings of it, but there's definitely a lot more tooling that I think we could build on top of that as well.
Yeah. And then you have like, how's the data collected anyway?
Right.
Like, was it so like, is it organic and free range and ethically sourced, or you go like, nope, we went to prison populations to get this data, and you're going like,
right. I know, and that happens.
Right?
And so yes, exactly. That is, you want to understand, I mean, this is your whole like farm to table type of thing. You want to understand where your food came from, and so
you want to know where your data came from. Yeah, who raised your AI, right?
Yeah.
I was like, I want to see the parents of this AI. Does this AI have a moral compass?
Yeah.
Or is this AI, was this AI raised by wolves,
There's a t-shirt
a little
there
bit
somewhere.
feral. Yeah, exactly. AI trained by wolves. Although from what I understand, wolves have a very high functioning society as a collective. So maybe it might be a good thing. So if you could change anything about ethics and technology, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you do?
Well, I mean, that's I wish I had a magic wand, but I think that the issue when we talk about ethics is I want to shift it towards innovation. And I do think that treating ethics as, and I say this a lot, treating ethics like innovation material and innovation opportunity, because I want things that preserve my privacy. I want things that preserve my time. I want things that are secure by default and that work for everyone, that people want that and they're willing to pay for it. And so kind of shifting it from, let's do it as a moral obligation, which I think is important, but then it puts my morals against your morals, and putting it more towards an innovation opportunity and saying, hey, these guardrails actually create better products, they create better services, they help society better integrate technology into our system, and there's some natural barriers at place. I think that it framed as innovation versus us technologists are going to be more, the ethicists for the world. I think that's what I'd like to use my magic wand for.
So in terms of people who are interested in pursuing this, or having a career, or being part of the solution, what would you recommend to listeners?
I think you can be a part of the solution wherever you are, because it requires asking questions. And I think in some places it may not be safe to ask questions, but trying to create the conditions to ask those questions so that not just you do it, but you create the space for other people to do it as well. Because technology touches everything right now. And so you don't need to like give up your job and say, I'm going to go, to Margarita school and become like a new type of technologist. But I think you could create the space in the place you're working right now by asking some of those hard questions. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Who's it for? Who's going to be impacted? Are those people a part of the conversation? And do it in a really humble way that helps to move the conversation forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was far-ranging. I appreciated your candor on the topic, because tech ethics can be really thorny. There's a lot of controversy around it, and I know that everyone's trying to get their footing, trying to figure out, how to do it, a direction. And I think it's one where if we can, certainly as an industry, but also for consumers, to look at it and say, look, we're all trying to figure this out. So how do we get as many people thinking about it and having a conversation where we can collectively figure it out, and we can get better? Because the fact of the matter is, people are going to make mistakes, and shaming and blaming actually isn't going to get anyone where we want to be. But it's like, okay, we did this, and having a lot of people examine it and say like, oh, this is where it doesn't work. Thank you for telling me so I can stop doing that.
Yes.
You know, if I'm doing something wrong, please do me the favor of letting me know. So that, and not just saying like, okay, this is caused harm, but and I have an idea of how to fix it. Yay, right? Just and because we have to just keep on iterating. And I think not only ethics as an innovation opportunity, but so like how do we innovate ethics? I mean, how do we use how do we apply the innovation process to ethics, right? So we can expand our understanding. There's going to be all sorts of failures, but how do we use that failures as a basis for collectively learning, right? As opposed to everyone doing a private failure and we all replicate the private failure because we were too ashamed to tell everyone else.
Yes, exactly.
Do that.
Right.
And everyone, it's like, I'm so embarrassed that I stepped into the pothole, right? I'm not going to tell anyone because I'm so ashamed. And then like 10 other people fall into the pothole. I mean, that's like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
We should say like, watch out, the first step is a doozy. You're going to like come out battered and bruised. So let's go and fix it. And I think if we can have more of that spirit where there's compassion, right? And everyone's trying the best they can, but if we can be more transparent about it and learn from each other, I think that actually starts moving things in a better direction.
Oh,
But
yeah, totally.
but we have to be brutally honest. Like you're like, oh yeah, you know, we thought this was going to be awesome, and then it ended up being used for reverse targeting of people. And so we say like, stop now.
Yeah. And here's what we're doing
Right?
differently now from what we learned. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you
Where
so much. It was wonderful speaking to you. I mean, this is just, I think we could talk for hours. So I really appreciate the time with you as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Mira. So for listeners, we will have relevant links in the show notes. And Mira can be found on Instagram, Mira Lane, one word, Miralane. She is also on Twitter, but there she is Mira_Lane. So, but we will include her social media handles in the show notes as well. Thanks so much, Mira.
Thank you.